The rain didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like an insult. It poked at the back of Arthur's neck as he stood on the cracked pavement of the county courthouse steps. Clutching a yellow envelope like it was the last piece of solid ground on earth, inside that envelope was a deed. Not a deed to a mansion or even a modest suburban home with a white fence, but a deed to a residential improvement located at 402 Blackwood Lane. Cost $600 total. Arthur didn't look like a property mogul. He looked like a man who had been chewed up by a decade of bad luck and finally spat out. His boots were held together by a prayer and a bit of duct tape he'd found in a gas station trash can. His car, a rusted sedan that groaned every time it hit 20 miles per hour, was currently his bedroom, his kitchen, and his closet. He had exactly $42 left in his pocket. If this house didn't have 4 walls and a roof that worked, Arthur knew he'd be spending the winter under a bridge. He climbed into the driver's seat, the springs screaming in protest. He turned the key. The engine hesitated, coughed a cloud of blue smoke, and then hummed into a shaky life. He followed the map he'd hand-drawn from the records office, heading away from the bright lights of the city and toward the parts of the state where the trees grew thick and the people grew thin as he drove. Arthur thought about how he'd gotten here. It wasn't a dramatic explosion of failure. It was a slow leak. A job that went away when the factory moved overseas. A back injury that made manual labor a nightmare. A stack of bills that grew faster than the grass in summer. He wasn't looking for a miracle. He just wanted a door he could lock. 2 hours later, the asphalt turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to dirt. The GPS on his phone had died miles ago, but the hand-drawn map led him to a narrow path overgrown with briars and weeds that clawed at the sides of his car. Then, he saw it. It looked less like a house and more like a pile of wood that had decided to give up on being a building. Vines thicker than Arthur's wrist climbed up the siding, pulling the gutters down toward the earth. The porch had a literal hole in the center where a tree had begun to sprout through the floorboards. The windows were gray with decades of grime, and the front door was hanging by a single rusted hinge. Arthur sat in the car for a long time. He didn't cry. He didn't have the energy for that. He just stared at the $600 wreck while he whispered to the empty car. At least the neighbors won't complain about the noise. He stepped out, the damp air smelling of wet earth and rotting cedar. He walked toward the door, his heart thumping against his ribs. He pushed the door, and it gave a long, mournful creak that sounded like a ghost exhaling. The inside was worse than the outside. The smell hit him first, a thick, heavy scent of damp dust, old paper, and something metallic. Trash was piled in the corners, old newspapers from the 1960s, rusted cans of soup, and furniture that had been chewed by generations of mice. But as Arthur walked through the living room, his foot hit something solid. The floor didn't creak. It sounded hollow. He moved a heavy, mold-covered rug aside with the toe of his boot. Underneath, the wood was different. It wasn't the cheap pine used in the rest of the house. It was heavy oak, and there was a ring pull made of solid iron set into the floor. Arthur knelt down. His hands were shaking. He wasn't thinking about hidden treasure. He was just hoping there wasn't a hole leading into a flooded basement. He gripped the iron ring, braced his feet, and pulled. The heavy door resisted at first, the wood groaning against the frame. Then, with a loud crack, it swung upward. A gust of air rushed out, air that felt cold, dry, strangely clean. Arthur pulled a small plastic flashlight from his pocket and clicked it on. The beam sliced through the darkness of the hole. He expected to see mud or spiders. Instead, his light hit the bottom of a set of stone stairs that looked like they belonged in a castle, not a shack. He took a breath, tucked his flashlight under his chin, and began to climb down into the belly of his $600 ruin. He didn't know it yet, but the man who had entered that house with $42 was never going to be the same. Man again, the air in the hidden cellar was different from the air in the house above. Upstairs, everything smelled like decay, wet rot, and the slow surrender of wood to time. But down here, past the third stone step, the air was crisp. It was unnervingly dry. Arthur's flashlight beam flickered, the batteries complaining. but it was enough to show him that the walls weren't made of dirt or rotting timber. They were thick, poured concrete, smoothed over with a precision that didn't match the ramshackle hut sitting on top of it. Arthur's heart was hammering a rhythm against his ribs that he could feel in his teeth. He took the last step. His boots clicked on a floor that was perfectly level. As he panned the light around, he realized he wasn't in a basement. He was in a vault. Against the far wall stood 3 heavy industrial shelving units. They weren't rusted. They looked almost new, despite the layer of fine gray dust coating everything. On the shelves were dozens of olive-drab metal canisters, the kind used by the military to store ammunition, but these were larger. Each one had a heavy latch and a rubber seal around the lid. Arthur approached the first shelf. His mind was racing through every bad scenario. Was this some kind of hazardous waste? Was he standing on top of something illegal? He reached out, his fingers trembling, and wiped the dust off a small plastic sleeve attached to the front of the first canister. Inside was a handwritten card. The handwriting was tight, disciplined, and slanted to the left. It didn't say gold or money. It said Triticum Estivum, Heritage Grade A- 1974. Arthur frowned. He wasn't a scholar, but he knew enough to be confused. He moved to the next one. ZMA's Blue Flint, 1976. He kept moving the light. Row after row of these labels. He realized he was looking at a library. Not a library of books, but a library of life. He sat down on a wooden crate in the center of the room, the weight of his exhaustion finally catching up to him. He was a man who had been worried about where he would sleep tonight, and now he was sitting in a climate-controlled bunker hidden under a $600 pile of junk. He decided to open one. He picked a smaller canister, one labeled with a date from 1972. He pulled the metal latch. The seal broke with a sharp hiss of equalizing pressure. The sound echoed in the small room, making Arthur jump. Inside, he didn't find coins or jewels. He found hundreds of small glass vials, each one corked and dipped in wax. Inside the vials were seeds. To anyone else, it might have been a disappointment. But Arthur remembered his grandfather talking about the great loss in the farming communities, how the old crops, the ones that tasted like heaven and could survive a drought without chemical help, had vanished, replaced by corporate seeds that you had to buy every single year. Arthur picked up a heavy ledger sitting on a small desk in the corner. He opened it to the first page. There was no name, just a mission statement written in that same tight handwriting. They are erasing the past to control the future. If the world forgets how to feed itself without a bill of sale, then the world is no longer free. I will keep the fire until the woods grow cold. Arthur realized then that the person who lived here before him wasn't a crazy recluse. They were a guardian. He climbed back up the stairs, closing the heavy oak hatch and pulling the moldy rug back into place. He walked to the window and looked out at the overgrown yard. For the first time in 3 years, Arthur didn't feel like a victim of bad luck. He felt like he had been given a job to do, but the discovery brought a new kind of fear. If this was worth what he thought it was, he couldn't just tell anyone. He looked at his rusty car and his torn clothes. He was a nobody. If he walked into a university or a government office claiming to have $1 billion seed vault, they'd probably just take it from him, or worse. They'd take the land back. He had to fix the house. He had to make it look like he belonged there. He spent the next 3 days working until his fingernails bled. He cleared the briars from the front door. He used his last $40 to buy plywood and industrial cleaning supplies. He scrubbed the floors until the wood grain reappeared. Every muscle in his body ached. But every time he felt like quitting, he thought about the cold, dry vault beneath his feet. On the 4th night, as he sat eating a cold can of beans by the light of a single candle, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A car was coming up the dirt path. No one had used this road in years. The headlights swept across the front of the house, bright and accusing. Arthur blew out his candle and crept to the window, his heart thumping. A dark SUV pulled to a stop. A man stepped out, dressed in a sharp suit that looked out of place in the mud. He didn't look like a buyer. He looked like an investigator. Arthur realized the $600 house hadn't just been a bargain. It had been a mistake, and someone was coming to collect. Arthur stood in the dark, his breath coming in shallow, quiet gasps. He pressed his back against the peeling wallpaper of the living room, listening to the heavy thunk of the SUV door closing outside. The sound echoed through the woods like a gunshot. He peeked through a crack in the boarded-up window. The man in the suit was standing there, holding a flashlight that looked more expensive than Arthur's entire car. The beam was powerful, cutting through the night and illuminating the piles of debris Arthur hadn't managed to haul away yet. The man didn't look like a thief. He looked like someone who owned things. He walked with a confidence that made Arthur's stomach turn. He watched as the stranger walked up the sagging porch steps. The wood groaned under the man's weight, a warning that Arthur knew all too well. There was a sharp, rhythmic knocking at the door. "I know you're in there," the man called out. His voice was calm, almost polite, which somehow made it scarier. "I saw the tire tracks in the mud. I just want to talk about the property." Arthur didn't move. He thought about the iron ring under the rug in the other room. He thought about the Heritage Grade A labels and the mission statement in the ledger. If he opened that door, was he giving up the only thing that had ever made him feel important? "The county records say this place was sold at auction," the man continued. "There was a clerical error. The land wasn't supposed to be on the list. I'm here to offer you a way out. A refund, plus a little extra for your trouble." Arthur felt a spark of anger. A clerical error. He knew what that meant. It meant someone realized they'd left the vault unguarded, and they wanted it back. He walked to the door, took a deep breath, and unlatched the lock. He didn't open it all the way. He just cracked it enough to show his tired, dirt-smudged face. "I bought it fair and square," Arthur said. His voice was raspy from disuse. "The deed is signed. It's my house." The man in the suit smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Miller. I represent a development group. We've been tracking this specific plot for a long time. Look at this place, friend. It's a death trap. You've got no power, no water, and the roof is caving in. Take the $5,000 I'm offering and go find a nice apartment in the city. Why die out here in the dirt?" $5,000. To Arthur, that was a fortune. It was enough to get a real bed, a hot shower, and a few months of peace. But he looked past Miller at the woods, then back at the floorboards where the secret lay hidden. He realized that if Miller was offering $5,000, the vault was worth $5 million or more. "Not interested," Arthur said. He started to close the door. Miller stepped forward, putting his shiny shoe in the doorframe. The politeness dropped away like a mask. "Listen to me. This isn't just about a house. The man who lived here before the one who died alone in that chair, he stole things that didn't belong to him. Research, data, things that belong to the people I work for. You're sitting on a liability. If you stay here, things are going to get very difficult for you." Arthur stared at him. He didn't steal anything. He saved it. Miller's eyes widened slightly. He knew Arthur had found the cellar. The silence between them grew heavy, filled only with the sound of the rain starting to fall again on the tin roof. "You don't know what you're playing with," Miller whispered. "You're a guy with a broken car and a $600 shack. You think you can change the world? You'll be lucky if you survive the winter." Miller pulled his foot back, turned on his heel, and walked back to his SUV. He didn't look back. As the red taillights disappeared down the trail, Arthur felt a wave of cold fear wash over him. He wasn't just a squatter anymore. He was a guardian, and he was being hunted. He spent the rest of the night in the cellar. It was the only place he felt safe. He sat at the small wooden desk and turned the pages of the ledger again. He learned about the man who built it, a man named Silas, who had been a head scientist at a massive chemical company. Silas had realized that the company was intentionally destroying old seed varieties so they could force farmers to buy modified versions that required specific, expensive fertilizers. Silas had spent 20 years smuggling samples out, one vial at a time. He had built this concrete fortress to protect the old world from the new one. Arthur read about the great wheat of 1920 and the crimson tomato. Silas wrote about how these plants could grow in poor soil, how they could survive pests without poison, and how they could feed a village for pennies. As the sun began to peek through the cracks in the floorboards above, Arthur realized he couldn't stay hidden forever. Miller would be back, and he wouldn't bring a checkbook next time. Arthur looked at the jars of seeds. He didn't have money, and he didn't have power. But he had the one thing the big companies were terrified of, had the past. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He had one bar of service. He didn't call the police. They wouldn't understand. He didn't call the county. They were probably the ones who told Miller about the error.
Is dead.
He searched for the one name he remembered from his grandfather's stories, an old professor at the state university who had been fired for talking too much about natural sovereignty.
His
Hands shook as he dialed the number. He knew that once he made this call, there was no going back. The $600 house was about to become the center of a war. "Hello?" A weary voice answered on the third ring. "My name is Arthur," he said, his eyes fixed on the heritage labels. "I bought a house on Blackwood Lane. I think I found Silas's library. And I think someone is coming to burn it down." The morning light was thin and gray, filtering through the dust motes of the living room like ghosts dancing in the air. Arthur hadn't slept. Every time a branch scraped against the siding or a floorboard groaned under the shifting weight of the house, he jumped. He felt small. He felt like a grain of sand trying to stop a tidal wave. He kept his old wrench in his hand, not because he wanted to hurt anyone, but because it was the only thing that made him feel like he had some grip on reality. The professor had told him to wait. "Don't move anything," the voice on the phone had warned. "Don't open any more canisters. You don't realize how fragile that environment is. If you let too much humidity in, you could kill 50 years of history in an hour." Arthur sat on the porch steps, watching the road. He was hungry. His stomach felt like it was folding in on itself, but he couldn't eat. The stakes were too high now. He looked at the dirt under his fingernails and wondered how a man who had been a week away from sleeping on a park bench was now protecting the future of food. It felt like a movie, but the cold wind hitting his face reminded him it was very, very real. Around noon, a vehicle appeared. It wasn't the sleek black SUV that Miller had driven. It was a battered blue pickup truck that looked even older than Arthur's car. It rattled and clanked as it navigated the deep ruts of the driveway. It came to a halt, puffing out a final cloud of white smoke. An older man climbed out. He was tall and thin, wearing a thick wool cardigan that looked like it had been through a few wars, and a pair of spectacles. Held together with a tiny piece of wire, he looked at the house, then at Arthur, then back at the house. He took off his hat, revealing a head of wild white hair. "You must be the one who called," the man said. He didn't offer a hand to shake. He was too busy staring at the structure. "I'm Julian. I haven't been down this road in 25 years. I thought Silas had taken his secrets to the grave." Arthur stood up, feeling a wave of relief so strong he almost stumbled. He left a lot behind, Julian. "It's under the kitchen." Julian's eyes sharpened. The wariness seemed to drop away from him. He actually did it. He actually built the vault. We used to talk about it in the labs late at night, back when the world was still sane. He called it the Ark. Most of us thought he was just dreaming. We thought the corporations would find him before he ever finished the concrete pour. Arthur led him inside. He moved the rug and opened the hatch. The look on Julian's face when the light hit those stone stairs was something Arthur would never forget. It was the look of a man seeing a long-lost child. They went down together. Julian moved with a sudden frantic energy, his hands hovering over the canisters but never quite touching them, as if they were made of thin glass. He began reading the labels aloud, his voice trembling. The Blue Flint. The Highland Rye. "Oh, Silas, you magnificent old fool. You actually saved the 1974 crossbreed." Julian turned to Arthur, tears welling up behind his glasses. "Do you have any idea what this is? This isn't just seeds. This is the blueprint for survival. The seeds we use today are weak. They need chemicals to live. They need the companies to survive. But these were bred to be tough. They were bred to be independent, just like Silas." But the moment of wonder was cut short. A loud, rhythmic thumping started above their heads. It wasn't a knock on the door. It was the sound of heavy boots walking across the floorboards. Multiple sets of boots. Arthur froze. He looked at the hatch. He had forgotten to lock the front door in his excitement. "Stay here," Arthur whispered to Julian. He gripped his wrench and started up the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he poked his head through the hatch, he saw 3 men. Miller was there, looking polished and cold in the center of the room. Beside him were 2 men in work uniforms, heavy-set guys with tool belts and crowbars. They weren't there to talk anymore. "I told you it would get difficult," Miller said, looking down at Arthur. He didn't look angry. He looked bored, which was worse. "We did a title search this morning. It turns out the county didn't have the right to sell this plot. The previous owner had a standing lien that was never settled. The auction is void. You're trespassing, Arthur." Arthur climbed out of the hole, standing his ground even though his legs felt like jelly. "I have the deed. I have the receipt. You can't just walk in here." "I can," Miller said, nodding to the men. "And these gentlemen are here to begin the remediation of the site. This house is a safety hazard. It's being condemned as of 10 minutes ago. We have the permits to tear it down today." Arthur looked at the crowbars. They weren't here for the house. They were here to cave in the cellar. They wanted to bury the seeds under a ton of debris and concrete so that Silas's work would never see the light of day. If the seeds didn't exist, the corporation stayed in power. "You're not touching this floor," Arthur said, his voice cracking but holding firm. "Move him," Miller said quietly. One of the big men stepped forward, reaching for Arthur's shoulder, but before he could grab him, Julian's head appeared from the hatch. "Wait," the professor shouted. He was holding the ledger high in the air. "You want to talk about liens and titles? This book contains the original land grant from 1890. It also contains the names of every board member Silas worked with who took bribes to suppress this data. If you touch one board in this house, I'll have this scanned and sent to every news outlet from here to the coast before your bulldozers even arrive." Miller paused. He looked at the old book. For the first time, the calm mask slipped. A flicker of genuine hesitation crossed his face. He knew that a legal battle over a house was one thing, but a public scandal involving corporate sabotage was another. "You're an old man with a dusty book," Miller spat. "Nobody cares about what happened in the 70s. The farmers care," Arthur said, stepping forward. "The people who are paying triple for seeds care. The people who are tired of being told what they can and can't grow on their own land. They care." The standoff lasted for what felt like hours. The rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Arthur realized that he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Silas, for Julian, for everyone who had been stepped on by people like Miller. Finally, Miller checked his watch. He looked at the 2 men with the crowbars, then at Arthur. "This isn't over. You can't stay in this shack forever. You'll run out of water. You'll run out of food. And when you do, I'll be waiting at the end of the driveway." He turned and walked out, his men following close behind. The sound of the SUV driving away was the sweetest thing Arthur had ever heard. He sank to the floor, the adrenaline leaving his body all at once. Julian climbed out of the hatch and sat down next to him. The old man was shaking, but he was smiling. "We won the first round," Julian said. "But he's right. We can't stay here. We need help. Real help." Arthur looked around the room. The eyesore didn't look like a wreck to him anymore. It looked like a fortress. "What do we do now?" Julian looked at the ledger. "We do what Silas should have done 30 years ago. We stop hiding. We bring the world to us." Arthur knew the fight was just beginning. He still only had $42, and he was still living in a house with no heat. But as he looked at Julian, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving. He was building something, and he wasn't going to let anyone tear it down. The days following the confrontation with Miller were a blur of nervous energy and hard work. Arthur knew that Miller wasn't the type to give up. He was the type to wait for the cover of darkness. But Arthur wasn't alone anymore. Julian, with his wild hair and his old truck, had brought more than just knowledge. He had brought a plan. Within 48 hours, the dirt path leading to the house was no longer empty. Arthur stood on the porch, watching as 3 more vehicles bounced up the trail. These weren't corporate SUVs. They were dusty sedans and wagons driven by people who looked like Julian professors, graduate students, and old-school farmers with calloused hands and suspicious eyes. They arrived not with weapons, but with cameras, laptops, and portable generators. "If we keep this a secret, they can bury us," Julian told Arthur, as they set up a makeshift command center in the kitchen. "But if we make the whole world watch, they can't touch a single hair on your head without starting a fire they can't put out." Arthur spent those days acting as a sentinel. He moved his sleeping bag to the front room, right over the hatch. He didn't feel like a victim anymore. He felt like a guardian. He watched as the students began the delicate process of cataloging Silas's vault. They wore gloves and masks, carefully lifting the glass vials and documenting every label. The air in the house, once filled with the smell of mold, was now buzzing with the sound of hushed, excited conversations. One evening, a woman with graying hair and a camera sat down next to Arthur on the porch. Her name was Alina. She was a journalist who had spent her life covering agricultural stories that nobody else wanted to read. "You know," she said, looking out at the sunset, "most people would have taken the $5,000 and run. Why didn't you?" Arthur looked at his hands. They were still stained with the dirt of the cellar, but they were steady. "I've spent my whole life having things taken away from me. My job, my health, my dignity. When I bought this place, I thought I was just buying a box to hide in. But then, I found what was under the floor. For the first time, I felt like I was holding on to something that belonged to everyone. If I sold it to Miller, it would just disappear. I'm tired of things disappearing." The real change happened on the 5th day. Julian and the team had finished a preliminary report. They had found seeds for a type of wheat that hadn't been grown since the Dust Bowl, grain that could thrive in heat that would kill modern crops. They found medicinal herbs that had been the basis for treatments long forgotten. Julian called a press conference, though it was really just a group of people standing in a muddy yard. Arthur stood at the back, preferring the shadows. But Julian wouldn't have it. He pulled Arthur to the front, right in front of the cameras. "This man," Julian said, his voice echoing through the trees, "bought a house for $600. He was looking for a home. Instead, he found a future. This land is no longer a residential improvement. It is the Blackwood Seed Sanctuary. And as of this morning, it is under the protection of a non-profit trust." As Julian spoke, Arthur saw a familiar black SUV idling at the very end of the driveway, just beyond the property line. Miller was there watching through the windshield, but he didn't get out. He couldn't. There were too many eyes. There were too many cameras. The clerical error defense was dead. The safety hazard excuse was gone. The world now knew that 400 to Blackwood Lane was the most important house in the country. The story went viral. Within a week, donations began to pour in. People didn't just send money. They sent tools, lumber, and solar panels. A local construction crew showed up and offered to fix the roof for free. Simply because they were tired of seeing the little guy get pushed around, the house began to transform. The vines were cleared, not to destroy the building, but to reveal the sturdy logs underneath. The hole in the porch was repaired with reclaimed oak. The eyesore was becoming a landmark. Arthur stayed. He didn't want a mansion. He didn't want a suit like Miller's. The trust offered him a salary to be the permanent caretaker of the sanctuary. He finally had a job that meant something. He finally had a door he could lock. But more importantly, he had a door he could open for people who wanted to learn. On a quiet evening, after the crowds had left and the researchers had gone back to their hotels, Arthur went down into the cellar one last time before the new climate control system was installed. He sat at Silas's old desk. He picked up a pen and opened the ledger to the very last blank page. He thought about the man who had lived here before him. He thought about the loneliness and the fear Silas must have felt, keeping his secret for so many years. Arthur realized that Silas hadn't been waiting for a hero or a scientist to find his vault. He had been waiting for someone who knew what it felt like to be forgotten. because only someone who had been forgotten would understand how important it was to remember. Arthur wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page. The fire is still burning, and the woods are finally getting warm. He climbed back up the stairs, closed the hatch, and walked out onto his porch. The rain was falling again, but this time Arthur didn't mind. He wasn't shivering. He was home. A full year had passed since the day Arthur first pulled that rusted iron ring from the floorboards of the kitchen. Back then, the air in the house had felt like a tomb. Now, it felt like a beehive. The sound of the wind whistling through cracks had been replaced by the steady of a high-tech ventilation system and the quiet murmurs of people who actually cared about the earth. Arthur sat on his new porch. It wasn't a fancy porch, but the wood was solid, the nails were straight, and it didn't groan when he shifted his weight. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt and boots that didn't need duct tape to stay together. In his hand was a mug of coffee, the steam rising into the crisp morning air. He looked out at the 3-acre plot behind the house. It wasn't a tangled mess of briars anymore. It was a grid of vibrant, healthy green. The Blackwood Seed Sanctuary was no longer just a name on a piece of paper. It was a living, breathing reality. Under Julian's guidance, they had planted the first test crop of the ancient wheat Silas had hidden away. While the industrial farms 3 counties over were struggling with a record-breaking heat wave and brittle soil, Arthur's backyard was thriving. The stalks were tall, thick, a deep gold color that looked like polished brass under the sun. But peace didn't mean the danger had vanished. It had just changed shapes. Miller hadn't come back with crowbars or SUVs. Instead, the attacks came in the form of envelopes. Thick, white envelopes filled with legal jargon. The corporation Miller represented was now suing Arthur and the trust for patent infringement. They claimed that because some of the genetic markers in Silas's seeds were similar to their own lab-created varieties, the seeds actually belonged to them. They don't want the seeds because they need them, Julian said, walking out onto the porch to join Arthur. Julian looked older, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. They want the seeds so they can destroy them. They can't have a $600 house proving that their billion-dollar chemicals are unnecessary. Arthur looked at the field. How much time do we have before the court order? The hearing is on Friday? Julian sighed. If the judge signs that paper, they can come in here with a crew and quarantine the crop, which is just a polite way of saying they'll burn it to the ground to prevent cross-contamination. Arthur felt that old coldness in his chest. He had spent his whole life losing. He had lost his health, his savings, and almost his mind. But as he looked at the golden wheat, he realized he wasn't that scared man on the courthouse steps anymore. He had something worth fighting for. They think this is about law, Arthur said, setting his coffee down. But it's actually about people. We need to stop playing their game on their turf. Arthur spent the next 48 hours on the phone and on the internet. He didn't call lawyers. He called the people who had been following his story since the beginning. He called the small-scale farmers who were barely making ends meet. He called the community gardeners in the city who were trying to feed their neighbors. He told them one thing: the harvest is ready. If you want a piece of the past, come and get it. On Thursday night, the night before the court hearing, a line of headlights appeared at the end of Blackwood Lane. It wasn't one SUV, it was dozens. Old trucks, rusted vans, and even a few tractors. Hundreds of people arrived. They didn't bring signs. They brought buckets, bags, and hand sights. Arthur stood at the edge of the field, his heart swelling. If the seeds are in the ground, they can sue us, Arthur told the crowd. If the seeds are in 1,000 different pockets across 10 different states, they can't do anything. Tonight, we aren't just harvesting wheat. We're spreading the fire. Under the light of the moon and a few portable work lights, the greatest harvest in the history of the county began. Men and women who had never met worked side by side. They cut the stalks, they threshed the grain by hand, and they filled small cloth bags with the Heritage Grade A seeds. By the time the sun began to rise on Friday morning, the field was empty. The golden wheat was gone. In its place was just the dark, rich earth. But in the parking lot, hundreds of people were driving away, carrying the genetic gold mine in their trunks and on their laps. When Miller arrived at 9 a.m. with a group of federal marshals and a destruction order, he found Arthur sitting on the porch, alone, drinking his coffee. Miller looked at the empty field, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. He stormed up to the porch, waving a piece of paper. "Where is it? Where is the crop? You're in contempt of a federal court. I'll have you in a cell by noon." Arthur stood up slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, tiny vial of seeds, the very first one he had opened in the cellar. He held it up to the light. "You're too late, Miller," Arthur said calmly. "The seeds aren't here. They're in gardens in the city. They're on farms in the valley. They're in the hands of people who actually know how to grow things. You can sue me. You can take this house. You can even put me in a cell. But you can't sue 1,000 people at once. And you can't patent the wind." Miller stared at him, his mouth hanging open. For the first time, the man in the suit looked small. He looked like the one who had lost. Arthur didn't go to jail. The public outcry was so massive that the corporation quietly dropped the lawsuit to avoid a total PR disaster. The Blackwood Seed Sanctuary stayed in Arthur's hands. Years later, people would tell the story of the man who bought a $600 house and found a treasure. But they wouldn't talk about gold or money. They would talk about the bread that tasted like the old world. They would talk about the plants that grew when nothing else would. And they would talk about Arthur, the man who was almost homeless, who ended up giving a home to the future of the world. Arthur lived in that house until his hair was as white as Julian's. He never became a millionaire. He never bought a fancy car. But every morning, he would sit on his porch, look at his field, and know that he had done the one thing most people never get to do. He'd left the world a little bit better than he found it. The winters in the valley had always been harsh. But this year, the snow seemed to fall with a different kind of silence. Arthur stood by the wood-burning stove in the kitchen of the Blackwood house. He was much older now. His hands, once quick and nervous, were slow and steady. The house was warm not because of expensive heaters, but because the community he had helped build had spent the autumn sealing the windows and stacking enough seasoned oak to last to winters. He looked down at the floor. The old moldy rug was gone, replaced by a beautiful, hand-woven carpet given to him by a family 3 towns over. Underneath that carpet, the hatch still remained. It wasn't a secret anymore. It was a museum. Groups of schoolchildren and young scientists visited weekly to see the mother vault. One afternoon, a young man arrived at the door. He didn't have a suit or a briefcase. He had a backpack and a small wooden box. He looked a bit like Arthur had 40 years ago, dusty and looking for a place to stand. "I'm from the coast," the young man said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "My grandfather was one of the people who came to your harvest back when the lawsuits were happening. He passed away last month, but he told me I had to bring this back to where it started." He opened the wooden box. Inside was a heavy glass jar filled with seeds. But these weren't the seeds from the vault. These were the descendants. "These are from the 10th generation," the young man explained. "They've adapted to the salt air and the sandy soil. They've changed, but they're still strong. My grandfather called them Arthur's Grace." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He invited the young man in for tea. As they sat by the fire, Arthur realized that his $600 investment had paid out a dividend that no bank could ever calculate. The seeds had traveled thousands of miles. They had fed people through recessions and droughts. They had become a part of the land again. Later that evening, after the young man had left to stay at the local inn, Arthur went down into the cellar. He didn't need a flashlight anymore. The room had soft, warm LED lighting powered by the solar array on the barn. He sat at the desk and looked at the wall. It was covered in photographs. There was Julian, laughing at a harvest festival. There were the students who had gone on to start their own sanctuaries. And in the center was a small, grainy photo of the house as it looked the day Arthur bought at a collapsing wreck that everyone else had called worthless. Arthur realized that the discovery everyone talked about wasn't really the seeds. The seeds were just a catalyst. The real discovery was that a man who felt he had no value could find a purpose that was bigger than himself. He had bought a house to hide from the world, and instead, he had found a way to save it. He picked up the ledger one last time. The pages were full now. Hundreds of names were written in the back, people who had taken a bag of grain and promised to keep the line going. Arthur took his pen, and with a hand that shook just a little, wrote the final entry in the book. "The debt is paid," he wrote. He wasn't talking about the $600. He was talking about the debt. He felt he owed to life for giving him a second chance. He stood up, turned off the lights, and climbed the stone stairs. He didn't lock the hatch. He didn't need to. The treasure was no longer under the floorboards. It was everywhere. He walked to his bedroom, the house creaking gently around him like an old ship. He lay down and listened to the wind. It didn't sound like an insult anymore. It sounded like a song. Arthur closed his eyes, a smile on his face, knowing that even if he didn't wake up tomorrow, the harvest would continue without him. The $600 house stood on the hill, its windows glowing like a lantern in the dark. A small, humble lighthouse in a very large world.